Hello again, U.S. history students. This is Mr. Baker, Baker's Corner, Baker's Backyard. Hope you're doing well. We are transitioning our attention this week and early next week into social and cultural developments within our early 19th century. So our objectives you can see in front of us. We're going to explain using examples, specific people, etc. How the early 19th century impacted the development of American nationalism through art, literature, and architecture. Okay, so guys, when we think of literature, we think of writings, people putting physically down on paper, creativity and things like that show all these things. Art, paintings, and then also architecture, the idea of making structures and things that reflect a lot of these things that we're going to be looking at. Secondly, we want to think, guys, beyond just those developments. How do we still continue to see this importance of virtue, okay? And how it impacts the role of women in our society as mothers especially, and also with the development of good citizenship toward a good republic. So let's go ahead and get started. So the question that comes to mind, guys, when we're thinking of nationalism and also sectionalism is, remember, these are two ideas that are not new to us. The idea of nationalism is things that kind of spur this confidence and support for your country, your nation, in other words, okay, as a whole. But what is sectionalism? This idea of interests driving certain regions, whether it's the Northeast or the old Northwest or current Midwest or even the South, and how different things politically, socially, economically, and even culturally are going to drive a lot of these things, okay? We'll look a little bit here in a moment, guys, at Noah Webster with his famous dictionary. That's his picture in the bottom right. But before we get to American examples of these writings, we need to consider one important thing, which is the writing of a gentleman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, this is Tocqueville right here, a very young picture. He came over to the United States in the earlier 1830s. He makes a lot of observations. He writes about them. He reflects upon them. In other words, guys, he is a very well-known presence afterwards. And eventually he publishes this book in what is known as Democracy in America. Okay. Now, as you can see, he is obviously, by his name suggesting, guys, he is a Frenchman, but he is an aristocratic Frenchman, which I don't know if any of you have ever heard of aristocrats. But basically, guys, you're looking at upper class people that had wealth, prestige, money, okay, social class standing. And guys, check out on the next slide really quick. What does Tocqueville say? And the question is, guys, what are his words? Now, this is a very short excerpt of about a 430 to 445, 450 page book, depending on the source that you get it from. And guys, the question is, what does his words indicate about America's development? Now, keep in mind, he's over here in the early 1830s, okay? So if you're doing the math and you want to look at America as far as age, we're probably around 55 years of age, given the Declaration of Independence going back to the 1770s. So look at what this gentleman says and reflect upon that previous question, guys, as you read. You can pause this if you want to. But look at what he says. He says, the chief circumstance which has favored the establishment and the maintenance of a democratic republic in the United States is the nature of the territory which the Americans inhabit. Their ancestors gave them a love of equality and freedom. That goes back to the founding fathers, as they'll become known as later on. But God himself gave them the means of remaining equal and free by placing them upon a boundless continent. So what in the world is Tocqueville getting at here, guys? A lot of this goes back to the idea of the potential of the land, okay? That boundless continent. What kind of resources? We talked about this a little bit when we looked at the expedition of Lewis and Clark just a couple of weeks ago, guys. But the fact that those men are very, very tedious and active with writing down what they came into contact with, the flora, the fauna, in other words, the plants and animals, okay? And then also what else? The idea of resources, okay? All of those things. But look at what it says. The physical causes, independent of the laws which promoted general prosperity, are more numerous in America than they have ever been in any other country in the world at any other period of history. We won't read all the rest of it. You're welcome to stop if you want. Everything is what? Extraordinary in America. The social condition of the inhabitants as well as the laws, but the soil upon which these institutions are founded is more extraordinary than all the rest. Now, essentially, guys, what he's doing here in a very short amount of time with this excerpt, guys, or space, is he's basically making it clear there's a lot of potential in this land. Okay? And think about, guys, what that potential might be beyond just economic. Now, let's face the facts. Okay? It is not favorable that we have a system of slavery that obviously is very essential to the Southern economy, but nonetheless is also very detrimental to people's lives. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. But the nature of some of the things that do define some of what some historians call, guys, this American exceptionalism, the way that we're going to develop differently than other places, is arguably another thing that he's getting at. Okay, what about the idea of Noah Webster? Well, take a look at the next slide. 3 areas in regards to expression. And his is obviously going to be linked more to the first one: language and literary accomplishments, architecture, and also landscape paintings and artwork. Now, when we think of Noah Webster, let's face the facts. What's the one common thing that usually comes to mind, ladies and gentlemen? You hit it. Words, vocabulary, the idea of a dictionary. Okay, so if you ever wonder why do you sometimes come across English literature that spells honor as H-O-N-O-U-R, whereas down the line, American dictionary literature, also uses just the O-R. A lot of that, guys, goes back to Noah Webster. Now, Webster was very, very smart. The arguments or the outlook is that he actually was very competent and functional. And I think it was as many as 26 languages, from Romance languages like Spanish and French to Germanic languages like German, Arabic, which will be another language school, etc. So, guys, this guy is very, very keen. And he understands that if we're going to create this American English dictionary, that it needs to define American culture on its own terms. Okay? And so what do we notice? We notice that also literature is going to become pretty important to America's development, guys, as a cultural place. Okay? Now, a lot of you guys might be thinking, well, Mr. Baker, is that to say that we don't really have poetry and things along those lines prior to this time period? The answer is we do. Okay? But a sizable amount of poetry was very linked to, like those of you that have heard the Puritans in New England. A lady by the name of Anne Bradstreet, I think it was, wrote a lot of these neat letters back and forth to her husband. Basically, a lot of them would be called love letters. Very inspirational, but the creativity that we associate, guys, with literature, which not only is important then, but also now, is going to be very important. So you see these schools of literature. You can stop the screen if you need to, guys, for the moment. But Washington Irving, a lot of people love his work because a lot of what he did, guys, was putting history into creativity within American literature. Okay, so for example, if you've ever heard of Rip Van Winkle, this is kind of a neat story. The story is, guys, is that you have this gentleman. You can read it on your own if you want to, but he falls asleep. He falls asleep, basically at the time of the Revolution. And what happens is that he wakes up years later, 20 or 30 years later, whatever it is. And what happens is he's hearing the native people, in other words, the Americans, talking about this George guy, but they're doing it in a very positive way. And so, as you can imagine, the guy is like a little bit dumbfounded because he's like, well, why are we talking about George, King George, in a positive way? Isn't he this tyrant? Well, which George are they talking about years later? George Washington. Okay, so he sets the tone with history, but he brings into it some creativity. And it's kind of cool because this guy wakes up, he's walking around, you know, a lot of the people he doesn't recognize, but some are older. So he's like, what in the world? These people are older. Well, yeah, you've fallen asleep. And he kind of figures that out. It's a very cool story. Okay. There's a case to be made for those of you that like debates out there that this is considered to be one of the really big first creative forms of American literature. All right. Of course, some people would disagree, but something to keep in the back of your minds. The Knickerbocker School is also going to be this group of people that are writing. Now, the thing that's interesting, guys, here is that a lot of these authors come from the Northeast. Not all of them do, but certainly a sizable number. So you notice the literature of James Fenimore Cooper. If you've ever heard of Last of the Mohicans, again, this is a story that takes place. Technically, it has some historical relevance because part of it does take place during the French and Indian War in the 1750s and 60s. But it does have some creativity in there. But it's very, very cool. And he does a really good job developing characters. And then we have, of course, some of the literature of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And then one of my favorite short story and also poets is going to be Edgar Allan Poe. What probably comes to mind if you're taking American literature as a junior at my school or another school perhaps? What is the one thing that usually comes to mind? We think of almost like horror-like stories, like Quoth the Raven, some of the things like that. So there's a case to be made, guys, that you're looking at almost like an earlier form of what some people would almost call kind of like horror stories that really established this very interesting way of thinking about literary presentation. Okay. So anyway, that's important. Now, what about art and architecture? Well, think about art. Art is nothing new. You've had cave art going back thousands of years. You've had obviously art that goes back to even the painting that was made of George Washington crossing the Delaware River. That's a pretty cool piece, as a lot of you have seen. You also have the picture of Washington standing tall, right? The painting that was actually rescued by Dolly Madison during the War of 1812. Well, guys, these paintings are going to be fairly different, all right? And think about it like this. The Hudson River School of Artists. The Hudson River is an area pretty much in close proximity to New York. So this group of artists is going to be very much connected there. If we say that they focused on landscapes, what does that mean? Many of these landscapes are going to be portraits that actually are wide in scope. Not all of them, but a sizable number. So guys, you're going to get to see a lot of these painters painting a lot of things like frontier life, the life of areas that are not as developed, not cities. Okay, so you're not going to see a lot of these paintings, guys, that focus on things like Boston, New York City, and places like that. So they're going to be very, shall we say, underdeveloped, not really developed because of industry. So a lot of frontier life, plants, animals. In other words, guys, something to underline in your notes if you're taking them: nature. The natural landscape is going to be what a lot of these artists or painters actually basically take into consideration. And I'll show you a few pictures in a second, but breathtaking stuff. And we'll talk about the long-term effects in a moment. And then also, guys, the architecture that we associate with the neoclassical. Now, we're going to come back to that, but think about when you think of classical civilization, a lot of you guys, if you've studied world history, you probably think of things like Rome and Greece. That's exactly the kind of things that we're coming back to, with especially attention brought to American government. All right, so stay tuned for that. So what do we see? Frederick Church. You don't have to worry about memorizing, guys, a lot of these names, but the concepts of their artwork, very important. So what do we notice? Yeah, we notice a lot of wildlife, trees, the mountains in the background, the hills, obviously the clouds. Looks like you see waterways. Okay, what do we not see in this picture? We really don't see a big focus on humans. You will see that a little bit in the next few examples, but not a lot. Why? Because, guys, humans a lot of times represent developments, especially when you're looking at the idea of cutting down trees and establishing areas that are more developed. Definitely something to keep in mind. One of my favorite paintings of the Hudson River School is Thomas Cole's painting here. Now, we do notice a little bit of human elements. You notice the small dwelling there. You notice, obviously, the house. You notice, if you look very closely, the person riding the horse. But the one thing to point out, guys, that does not take away the big picture of landscape. All right. The hills in the background, a few of the trees. You see probably what looks like either a pond or a stream of some sort. Okay. In other words, the natural habitat is still important. And then again, just a couple other examples. This one is one of my favorite ones. For those of you that have studied Manifest Destiny or heard of it, you know, what are these guys talking about? Are they talking about, well, where does the West lead us? Kind of like almost like an earlier form of a Daniel Boone kind of guy or whatever. Okay, so we notice again that. Now think about it like this. What would be an effect of the Hudson River School of Artists if they're focusing a lot of their attention, guys, on the idea of nature as opposed to development? And there's a case to be made, pardon me, that what they might want to be doing, guys, is really emphasizing the protection of nature against massive, large-scale development. Okay, and I want to show you a real quick picture. This is actually one from my wife and I going out to the Grand Canyon. A lot of you have heard of that, guys. The pictures that you see online, in my opinion, do not do it justice. That is literally an elk that is about 7 to 8 feet. Okay, so you're like, well, Mr. Baker, you know, I've been to a national park, you know, maybe it's Acadia or somewhere like that. Guys, what you could argue a lot of these people do, I don't know if it was an intentional thing or just a byproduct, but at the end of the day, it happened. You notice that there's going to be a lot of attention brought to protecting nature. Okay, and so this is a really cool picture. You notice a little bit of the vegetation, of course, the wildlife, and then the Grand Canyon in the background. Okay, we have a president that comes around, you know, about 80 years later by the name of Theodore Roosevelt, okay, that actually is going to be really, really big into protecting what he calls conservation, all right? He still believed in hunting and wildlife and things like that, but he also believed, guys, in protecting these lands. One historian put it like this about Roosevelt. He saw these lands as kind of like priceless things like you would find in the Louvre in Paris. What do you find in the Louvre in Paris? A lot of cool stuff. Mona Lisa, sculptures. In other words, very neat things that you want to basically hold on to for the next generation. In this case, guys, you're talking about holding on to the nature and its habitat. Okay. What about the idea of neoclassical? Well, think about what neo means. Basically refers to new. Okay, so we're talking about this resurgence of a focus on things like democratic values, like people participating, guys, in their government. That would be neoclassical, going back to Greece. And then also the idea of the Republic in Rome, where we're actually electing and voting for the people that we want to put into political office. Why do we have these pictures in front of us? There's another one on the next slide I'll show you. It's because, guys, a lot of these things like columns, all right, and also some of the circular things, like at the top here, guys, you'll notice like the area of Monticello, which is the house or at least the estate of Jefferson. Very cool if you've not been there. Jefferson did a really good job, not just kind of doing some things along these lines, but also things along the lines of having rooms that would teach kids and grandkids and people that would come through there things. So you would have busts of people like Christopher Columbus, or like the early presidents like John Adams, you know, of course, Jefferson, etc. And so, guys, what you're really looking at is you're looking at architecture that these men, right down here, of course, is the White House. So, you know, the vision of others. But anyway, guys, but the idea that you have attention being brought to the political heritage of the country. Okay, so let me show you another example really quick before we wrap this up. The question I have for you is, who is that? That's me a few years before. What is the building in the background? Do any of you know? It's actually the Supreme Court building. Okay. And so you notice, again, the columns, you notice the fountains, which are very common if you ever go to Rome and parts of Greece, from what I've been told. I've been to Rome, not Greece. Okay. And guys, this is a perfect example of trying to, again, instill America's political heritage into the idea of these places. Now, the question is, how does this play into our last topic? And that's going to be the idea of Republican virtues. But think about it. Republican virtues are things that reflect our thinking along the lines of government, things like separation of powers, checks and balances, the idea of restrictions to government power to an extent. Okay. And so, guys, what we notice is that you have these virtues that you could argue, okay, we want people to be good citizens, right? To be able to be good workers, good politicians, good family people like husbands, wives, kids growing up, etc. And so, guys, what you notice is that in his autobiography, Benjamin Franklin, this is a small piece of a much larger work, keep in mind, but he identifies 13 virtues that he sees at this period of time as essential to a good government and people within it. All right. Now, a lot of students in the past, guys, have asked Mr. Baker, they say, Mr. Baker, is this an exhaustive list of virtues? Exhaustive meaning that we don't have any more to really master or whatever. Well, first of all, I don't know if that was his intention, but I will say this, guys, if you can master some of these, or at least come close, you're probably moving into a good direction with how you're going to treat your family, your friends, possibly your constituents of people that you govern over or with, I should say. Okay, so I don't think you have to memorize all 13 of these, guys, but just keep in mind it's a list of things that, according to Benjamin Franklin, were absolutely vital to the establishment of good government. Now, a lot of you might be like, well, Mr. Baker, how does this play into what we've already talked about? Remember Washington's farewell address, where he says that things like religious principle and morality and virtue are all, what word does Washington use? Indispensable supports for political prosperity. Okay. So I don't know if somebody like Ben Franklin would say, I've mastered all 13 of these, but it's a place to establish, guys, good virtue. Okay. So you can see temperance, silence, order, knowing things in society have their place, being frugal, sincere, and of course, all the way down to humility. It's interesting how he says, imitate Jesus and Socrates. Interesting that he brings a religious figure to some, maybe even a figure that you would associate with like a prophet of a religion for some others. But definitely, guys, when we think of Socrates, we think of probably the idea of virtue along the lines of philosophy. Okay, definitely something to keep in mind. How does all of this play into the life of a good citizen? Glad that you asked. Okay, so the idea, guys, of good citizenship, first of all, is that we're selfless. All right, the opposite of selfish. Okay, so we're not just thinking of ourselves. If you're a politician, that you put your own interests aside for the idea that you're going to advocate for the common good, which is very closely associated with Republican values too. Okay. You'll notice, guys, over here, a lot of different influences with this idea of virtue. You'll notice, again, classical civilization going back to Greece and Rome. You notice the Enlightenment through things like checks and balances. Those of you who have heard of Montesquieu and the separation of powers concept, very important. You see that over here. The ideal citizen, being the best citizen that you can be, not just for yourself, but for the people that you interact with. Guys, remember, we use the word community. We can use that at a very global level, meaning literally the world, or we can also use that at a very small level when it comes to the idea of even, your family, right? Or even your school community, of several hundred people or maybe several thousand. Those of you that live in small towns, like I live in Rollsville, North Carolina, which is probably around 8,000 or 9,000, give or take. Okay, guys, it's much smaller than a place like New York City, but nonetheless, it is a community of people that have sets of interests and needs. Okay, and so what's the way that women play into this? Remember, there's going to be a lot of people like Abigail Adams who are making the argument that, yeah, you know, we as women still have a responsibility within the home, but you want us to be able to really teach and develop good citizens, you know, daughters, sons, etc., then you have to be able to make us educated in order to do it. Ergo, the role of Republican motherhood. Okay. Same thing as Republican womanhood, guys. The difference is, you know, you can not be a mother and be a woman, etc. You know where I'm going at with that. Okay. So why is that a big deal? The big deal is because there's going to be a lot of things thrown in there about moving us forward to be a country that is going to it's going to advocate for the needs of many different people that are somewhat left out of society. That will be our next lesson on reform. Okay. For those of you in week 5, you're going to have a couple of things to do. Those of you that are in class will be working on this a little bit each day. Okay. So first of all, make sure that you start to read through the reform movements reading that's under Q1 W5. Take some notes on that. Guys, there's a little handout, or at least there should be, that has a series of bubbles that kind of give you an idea of people's names in the big picture of these reforms. You want to be able to go a step further with understanding that. Okay. So complete the primary source exercise on reform movements by the end of Tuesday, or definitely by Thursday. That's a very important thing. You're going to have a series, guys, of about 4 or 5 documents, pretty short, that actually give you guys some food for thought on things like women's rights, abolition, the idea of even transcendentalist authors that some of you are going to read or have read in English class already. Okay. Education, believe it or not, becomes a big reform area, Okay. Day 2 this week for standard, you're going to be doing the same that you're used to. You're going to be doing your review activity that will cover vocab and also key concepts from the week. Okay. And then also honors, you'll be writing on a concept that will allow you to really analyze reform and or the idea of nationalism within these different things that we've looked at. Okay. Your mastery quiz will be on Friday. If you're in class that day during 7th period, you will actually have about the last 20 minutes to complete that quiz and make sure that you've done everything else that you need. For those of you that already have had class that part, in other words, 2nd or 3rd period earlier that week, then you will want to take your own time to actually complete that assignment. All right. And make sure you've submitted everything. Please contact me at bakerd@franklinacademy.org, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Be safe. And guys, as always, hope you are doing really well, and take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.